I'm going to talk, obviously, about food allergy in this context and focus more on how we think about IgE-mediated food allergies for the most part in the context of immune dysregulation. But in order to do that, it's important, first of all, to clearly distinguish sort of what is a food allergy from other kinds of adverse reactions to foods. So when I go to give a talk to students or to fellow physicians for continuing medical education or whatever, I'm plagued by the organizer telling me, I need your learning objectives, I need your learning objectives. So here are your learning objectives. We're going to talk about sort of what is a food allergy, what distinguishes it from other kinds of reactions to foods, why it's important to recognize the difference. And I think there are a lot of contexts where that's significant, not only for personal health, but also for society. Are food allergies truly more prevalent? Ramnik has shown compelling data that there's really no doubt that diseases of Western society, many of them immune-related, have expanded tremendously. Is this the case for food allergy as well? What are the leading hypotheses to explain this increase, and what can we do about it now? And if I could plot sort of the evidence base in relation to these in rank order, it would sort of be an inverse chart, an inverse relationship. So I'm going to move from sort of more concrete to more speculative and impressionistic, because in many ways, while we understand a lot about the pathophysiology of food allergy, particularly IgE-mediated food allergy, we really lag behind other immune disease areas in terms of our understanding of the basic pathophysiology and, in particular, the factors that contribute to its onset. So what is a food allergy? So how many people in the audience believe that they themselves or a significant person in their lives, a child perhaps, have food allergy? So what do you think, Ramnik? Is that maybe certainly 50% of the audience? Nevertheless, a lot of people are mistaken about thinking that they have food allergies because adverse reactions to foods are common, and there are many mechanisms by which they can occur. So we have to separate out among adverse reactions to foods those that are due to toxic effects of things that we ingest. So a classic example would be scromboid poisoning, which is a bacterial contamination of usually fish that elaborates a histamine precursor and causes many of the signs and symptoms of an allergic reaction. But this would not be reproducible, right? Presumably, most of the time you eat fish, you would have no problem, and once in a while, this might happen, especially if you're not very hygienic about your fish. Metabolic effects of foods, so these would include things like alcohol flush or the effects that some people experience with MSG, which can include flushing or headache, migraine, et cetera, caffeine. There are a number of things that we ingest that have metabolic effects on the body. These are not food allergies. We move down to the category then of non-toxic or non-metabolic, and these still include other things besides immune-mediated diseases such as lactase deficiency, and other intolerances, or anxiety or panic attacks around foods, which are sometimes comorbidities among people who have also food allergies. And finally, we get to this category of immune-mediated adverse reactions to food, and that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about allergy. And even then, within immune-mediated allergies, there are both IgE. IgE is a class of antibody that's responsible for immediate type reactions, and non-IgE forms of disease. So I'm sure most of you, or all of you, probably are familiar with the concept that you can't be allergic to something unless you've been exposed to it. And that is despite the fact that certainly more than half of my pediatric patients, well over half, experience an allergic reaction the first time they have a known ingestion of that food. Nevertheless, it is true that the immune system has to, at some point, seen that protein, that allergen, or something very similar to it, in order to present it to T cells, which Ramnik's already introduced us to, which provide help to B cells, which, among other things, in the case of an allergic response, will make IgE antibody. And it's upon secondary exposure, then, that IgE antibody now on the surface of effector cells, cells that will release histamine and cause the symptoms of allergy, do their business and cause an allergic reaction. In the case of non-IgE-mediated allergies, there are other mechanisms that we won't talk about so much, but they can also cause signs and symptoms of allergic reactions, although they are more delayed and differ in multiple ways. So why does that matter? You know, if you're, so if Louisa was running her restaurant and someone came and said, you know, I can't eat wheat, it doesn't really matter probably too much from her perspective. You know, she's not going to interrogate that person, well, are you going to have anaphylaxis if you eat wheat, or are you going to just sort of have a stomach ache, or what? But it does matter, I think, for people's personal health, and it also matters to get the diagnosis right for society. So it's IgE-mediated allergies that are mostly, although there's an important subset that this is less true of, are associated with potentially severe reactions, including anaphylaxis, which is just a multi-organ system kind of allergic reaction that rarely can lead to death. Non-IgE-mediated food allergies, in contrast, are associated with chronic health complaints, and they present much differently, and often it's more difficult to make the association. I don't have to be a particularly astute clinician to tell the parents of a 3-year-old who come in to see me that their child has peanut allergy when 5 minutes after eating peanut butter, their face blew up and they had hives and they started sneezing and wheezing. But in the case of non-IgE-mediated food allergies, it's often more difficult to make an association by history. Treatment and management options obviously also vary by diagnosis. So, in fact, even in some important subtle ways, so paradoxically, while IgE-mediated allergies can be more threatening in the acute setting, chronic immune-mediated adverse reactions to foods, such as celiac disease, which Ramnik mentioned, can be more sensitive ultimately in many people and more likely to lead to long-term health problems. So many of my patients with IgE-mediated food allergy, they must be very strict about their diet from the standpoint of potential immediate reactions, but some of them will actually have a higher threshold dose for having a reaction than is probably true for many people with something like celiac or eosinophilic esophagitis, another form of food allergy. And so the management of these things obviously varies accordingly. Most importantly, I would say incorrect diagnosis is a real problem, and there are serious limitations in our current testing that lead to a lot of overdiagnosis. So even if you believe that you have a food allergy and you know, it's not because you have lactose intolerance or some other adverse reaction to food, but you have a positive test, even then, interpreting that test requires some nuance. In order to do that correctly, we have to really understand from the history the likelihood of food allergy. We have to understand what we refer to as the pretest probability. Food allergies generally require low thresholds of exposure. They're very reproducible. They cause symptoms usually in minutes to hours, and they're typically associated with some organ systems and some types of presentations. So we use that history, obviously, to gauge what is the likelihood before testing that this person is allergic. And so if we evaluate someone, for example, who has a high likelihood of an allergy, and we use a test that has some intrinsic features of sensitivity and specificity, this is fairly typical, for example, of IgE-type tests. They have very high sensitivity. They have very poor specificity. So the likelihood ratio of a test like that is around 2. And so you move that person's likelihood of diagnosis from maybe just the history alone in the ballpark of 90% to the ballpark of 95%. But if you're seeing someone, for example, who has poorly controlled asthma, or a child who has moderate to severe eczema, it's much less certain whether or not food allergy is related to that clinical presentation. And in those cases, the positive value of a test like this is really marginal to none. You get really no benefit from the test, no additional useful information that can be acted upon clinically. And so we have to do something else. On the other hand, the value of a negative test, the same test, can be quite high with a similar sort of clinical presentation. So you can take that same person who comes in sort of with a moderate, sort of low-end pretest probability and really effectively rule out the idea that this is an IgE-mediated food allergy. So I go into that detail just to sort of explain or set the background for discussions about why tests are done or what how we evaluate someone's presentation. And in fact, there are circumstances where, although generally speaking, a test's performance is sort of an intrinsic feature of that test, it doesn't depend upon, in terms of its effectiveness, what the prevalence of a particular disease is. In some cases, and this is true often in pediatric food allergy, where you have really very, very high levels of IgE, much of it probably essentially germline, in other words, not really differentiated or particularly adaptive or driven, the test performance itself becomes poor, and you actually get even worse specificity, and you can actually lose information from the test rather than gain. So to heap on abuse here, for some diagnoses, for example, eosinophilic esophagitis, there really is no non-invasive test that we can do to evaluate whether or not that person has a specific food allergy. And sometimes symptoms associated with foods may not really fit into a well-described pattern of diagnoses, or foods may be non-specifically associated with some intrinsic disease and be a bit of a red herring. So for example, if you have Crohn's disease, you may get flares related to something that you eat, that yet the food itself is not likely to be the problem. So what do you do?